Wyoming Territory, June 1878. The sun had just dropped behind the Tetons when the shouting started. Zinnia Fairland stood her ground outside the church hall in Jackson, fists clenched at her sides, voice clear and strong. Women should have a say in how this town is run. We live here, we work here. We bleed here, and we are not property. That was all it took. The men, bankers, lumbermen, ranchers, shifted uncomfortably, murmured, then turned on her like wolves. Horace Wilkes, head of the town council, ordered 2 of his sons to drag her behind the feed store. She needs reminding of her place, he'd snapped. Zinnia kicked, cursed, bit one of them hard enough to draw blood. But they shoved her into the old toolshed behind the dry goods store and bolted it shut. Let her cool off, someone said. They left her there. The shed was barely 6 feet wide. Dust hung thick in the air. A rusted plow blade leaned against one wall beside a crate of mouse-chewed rope. No windows, no light, just the scent of old hay and the slow crawl of fear. She pressed her back to the wall, breathing through her nose. Her cotton dress clung to her skin. It would get cold soon, but she would not give them the satisfaction of crying. She did not know how long she stayed in the dark, long enough for the sounds of the town to fade, for her legs to cramp and her throat to dry. She tried kicking the door, screaming, but no one came until someone did. Footsteps, a man's voice low and cautious. "You in there?" Zinnia's heart jumped. She crawled to the door. Yes, they locked me in. The bolts scraped. The door creaked open, and there he was, silhouetted by moonlight, tall, broad-shouldered, hat pulled low. His shirt dusted with trail dirt, spurs still on his boots. He looked at her like he could not believe what he was seeing. "Name's Zeke Nolan," he said. "Heard about what happened, figured someone ought to do something." She stood slowly, wincing as her knees popped. Her voice came out rough. "You a lawman?" "No, ma'am, just a cowboy passing through. I was dropping off a shipment of cattle to the Wilkes Ranch. Heard them laughing about what they did to a woman with too many opinions." He paused. "Did not sit right with me." Zinnia stepped into the cool night, blinking hard. "You opened the door. You looked like you needed to rest." She swayed slightly. He reached out, steadying her with one hand on her forearm. It was a careful touch, respectful. Still, it made something tighten in her chest, not fear, not disgust, just something she had forgotten she could feel. He helped her to the edge of the water trough behind the store. She dipped her hands in, splashed her face. He gave her his canteen. She drank deep. "Thank you, Zeke," she said after a while. "I do not know what would have happened if you had not come." He tipped his head. "You should not have been in there to begin with." Zinnia studied him in the moonlight. His face was weathered, but there was a quiet kindness in his eyes, not pity, just understanding. "Where are you going next?" she asked. "I was planning to head west, but plans change." She looked away. "If they see you helped me, they might come after you too," he shrugged. "Let them try." They sat in silence. Somewhere a dog barked. A wind picked up, stirring dust across the road. Zeke stood. "You have people here?" "No, my parents died last winter. I run the late Mrs. Torley's dress shop now. The council does not like that I keep reading books and talking about taxes." He smiled at that. "Sounds like you scared them. Good." Something passed between them, not fast, not loud, just a small flicker of warmth in the dark. "I know a place," he said. "About 5 miles out. Old line shack by the creek. I camp there when I pass through. No one would find you." Zinnia looked at him carefully. "Why would you help me?" Zeke's voice softened. "Because I have never seen someone fight that hard to be heard. And because you should not have to sleep in a toolshed for speaking the truth." Her chest tightened again. She nodded. They slipped through the back alleys, avoiding the saloon lights and the sheriff's office. Zeke's horse was tied behind the livery. He helped her up, then climbed behind her. She leaned back slightly as they rode, not quite touching him, but close enough to feel his strength. The night was quiet. Stars above them, stretching wide. They reached the shack near midnight. It was small but clean. A cot, a stove, and a table with 2 chairs. Zeke stoked the fire, then stepped back to let her settle in. "You can sleep here," he said. "I will keep watch outside." Zinnia looked at him. "You do not have to do that." "I want to." She stepped over to him, took his hand. "Stay inside, please. You open the door." "Let me return the kindness." He hesitated, then nodded. Sat across the room while she curled under the blanket. She watched him through heavy eyes as he leaned his head back against the wall, arms crossed, staring at the fire. She fell asleep to the sound of wood crackling and the quiet rhythm of his breathing. When morning came, sunlight slanted through the window. She woke with her hair mussed and her limbs stiff, but something was different. She felt safe. Zeke was still in the chair, his hat pushed down over his eyes. He stirred when she moved. "Morning," he said, "morning." She rubbed her face. "You stayed up all night," could not sleep knowing someone might come looking. She stood, walked over, then sat across from him. "I do not know what this is," she said, "but I feel like I can breathe around you." Zeke looked at her. "I feel the same." Their hands brushed on the table. Neither of them pulled away. Zeke stepped outside just after dawn, letting the door fall shut behind him without sound. The air was cool, not cold, and the sun hadn't yet cleared the ridge. He walked down toward the creek, boots pressing soft into the damp earth, and washed his hands in water that ran clear and fast over stone. He didn't linger. She was inside, still waking, and it didn't sit right to leave her alone too long in a place she hadn't chosen. When he came back, she was standing near the stove, coaxing the coals back to life with a slender stick. Her sleeves were rolled up, eyes focused. She didn't look over when he entered. "I found some cornmeal in the cupboard," she said. "Looks old but not spoiled," he nodded. "There's a bit of salt in my saddlebag, I'll fetch it." By the time he returned, she had the pan heated and a thin batter ready to pour. He set the salt on the table and sat down slowly, watching the way she moved, purposeful, quiet, as if doing something with her hands kept the weight of everything else at bay. She didn't speak again until the cakes were browned and split between them. "I'm not afraid of them," she said, not looking up, "but I think I need to leave Jackson." Zeke chewed slowly, then set his fork down. "You planning where to go?" "Somewhere with work and dignity." She met his eyes, steady now, chin lifted. "I've got enough saved to get to Rock Springs, maybe further if I travel light. There's a woman there, runs a boarding house. I met her once years back. She said I'd always have a place if I needed it." He leaned back in his chair. "You trust her?" "I do," he nodded once. "Then I'll get you there," she blinked. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said simply. They finished the meal in silence, but it wasn't strained. Just a quiet shared space between two people who hadn't yet decided what to name this thing growing between them. After breakfast, Zinnia stepped outside and stood barefoot in the grass, letting the sun warm her face. Zeke watched from the doorway. She turned, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You always this helpful to strangers?" "No," he said. "But you didn't feel like one." She smiled, but it was a small thing, unsure at the edges. "You ever stay anywhere long?" "Few months here, season there. I ride fence, break horses, move cattle. Sometimes the work's honest, sometimes it ain't." "That ever bother you?" He thought on it. "Only when I leave folks behind I wish I hadn't." She looked down at her hands. "I used to think if I just worked hard and kept my name clean, I'd be safe. Turns out, being right doesn't matter much when you're a woman with no husband." Zeke stepped down off the porch. "You don't need a husband to be worth something." "No," she said, "but the world sure acts like I do." They packed the horse by mid-morning. Zinnia tied her bundle tight, just one bag slung over her shoulder. She didn't ask for help lifting it. Zeke didn't offer, but he watched to see if she stumbled. She didn't. They started southwest, tracing the edge of the Gros Ventre Range, staying clear of the main road. Zeke led them through cottonwoods and over shallow ridges, keeping to the high ground when he could. No one saw them leave. They camped that night under a stand of quaking aspens. The fire was small, just enough to warm beans and boil coffee. Zinnia pulled her shawl tighter and sat cross-legged, watching the flames. "You ever think about settling?" she asked. "I used to," he said. "Years back. Had a place near Laramie for a while, worked it with my brother. What happened? He died. Fever took him fast. I sold the land not long after, couldn't look at it without seeing him." She didn't respond right away. Then, "I'm sorry," Zeke nodded. "It was a long time ago." "Still feels recent sometimes." The fire snapped. Zinnia stirred the ashes with a stick, slow and thoughtful. "Do you know what you want now?" she asked. He looked at her, the curve of her shoulder, the way her brow furrowed when she was thinking. "I'm starting to," he said. She glanced over, met his eyes, then looked away again. "Me too." Her voice was quiet but sure. They didn't speak again that night, not even when they unrolled their blankets. But when she lay down, she did so a little closer to him than she had the night before. And when he turned his head in the dark, he could hear her breathing steady and calm. He watched the stars until his eyes closed. The wind moved gently through the leaves above them, and somewhere far off, an owl called once and was silent. The road narrowed into rockier country by the third day, winding along bluffs where the wind moved sharp and constant, carrying with it the dry scent of juniper and dust. Zeke rode ahead, reins loose in one hand, the other resting across his thigh. Zinnia followed close behind on the same horse, quiet and upright, her gaze steady on the path ahead. She hadn't spoken much since they left the aspens, though her silence didn't feel closed. It was the kind that settled in when one was sorting through too many thoughts. Zeke didn't press. He understood that kind of quiet. He'd lived in it for years. Around midday, they crested a ridge and found a small basin below, ringed with scrub pine and broken red stone. A half-collapsed line cabin stood near the far edge, roof sagging, door hanging crooked. Zeke pointed. "Storm'll come through tonight. Best we take shelter." Once they reached the cabin, Zeke dismounted and helped Zinnia down. The wind had picked up, snapping her skirt against her legs and pulling at the loose strands of hair that had escaped her braid. She pushed them behind her ear without comment. Inside, the cabin was dry but barely holding together. Zinnia stepped over a fallen beam and crouched near the hearth, brushing away debris with a worn piece of burlap. "There's a little wood left," she said. "Enough for supper, maybe," he nodded, kneeling to check the chimney draw. "I'll see to the horses. You think you can get it going?" She gave him a glance that was almost amused. "I've had worse to work with." By the time the wind turned to rain, they had a fire going and a kettle hung over it, the smell of coffee rising soft and bitter. Zeke sat on a crate near the flames, hat in his lap, watching the way Zinnia moved through the narrow space without hesitation. She poured 2 tin cups and handed him one. Her hands were reddened from the cold, knuckles chapped. He took the cup carefully, letting their fingers touch only for a moment. She sat across from him, back against the wall, one knee drawn up. The firelight caught the side of her face, throwing shadows across her cheek. "I used to think I'd marry a preacher," she said suddenly. "Or maybe a clerk, someone with clean hands and a quiet house." He watched her, not sure where the thought was headed. "But then I started noticing things," she went on. "How they looked at me when I spoke too sharply, how they flinched when I used words they didn't expect. I realized they didn't want a wife, not really. They wanted someone who'd stay quiet." Zeke sipped his coffee. "You ever think you'd marry at all?" "I did," she said. "But not anymore, not unless I could keep my voice." She looked up then, eyes steady. "You ever think about it?" He didn't answer right away. Rain tapped steadily against the roof and the wind rattled the door in its frame. "I've thought about 100 things," he said finally. "But most times I figured I'd end up alone, not because I wanted to, just never found someone who made the rest of the world quiet down." Zinnia traced the rim of her cup with one finger. "And now I've found someone who don't make noise just to fill the air. Someone who says what she means even when it gets her locked in a shed." Her mouth curved just slightly, not a smile, something smaller, more real. "I'm not easy," she said. "I get restless, I argue. I don't always know when to stop." "I don't mind a fight," he said, "so long as it's honest." Their eyes stayed locked for a long moment. Then she stood, slow and deliberate, and moved to sit beside him on the crate. Not touching, but close enough that he could feel the heat of her shoulder near his. "I've never sat this still before," she said softly. He tilted his head. "You want to keep moving?" "No." She looked into the fire. "Not tonight." He reached out gently and took her hand. It was cold, but she didn't pull away. Her thumb brushed his knuckles, slow and thoughtful. Outside, the storm deepened. Inside, they sat without speaking, the fire warming their hands, the silence between them no longer empty but full of something growing, something earned. As the last light faded from the sky, Zinnia leaned her head against his shoulder, and Zeke turned just enough to rest his cheek against her hair. Neither of them said anything more that night. They didn't need to. They broke camp at first light, the rain having passed quietly sometime before dawn. The sky was low and pale, clouds stretched thin like worn cloth. The air smelled of wet sage and ash, and the horse's breath fogged with each exhale. Zinnia tied her hair back with a strip of muslin she'd pulled from the hem of her petticoat, fingers quick and practiced. She hadn't spoken yet. Not out of discomfort, just a kind of inwardness that didn't demand explanation. Zeke adjusted the saddle cinch, checked the rifle slung behind the cantle. "We'll ride the canyon trail till mid-morning, then cut south. There's an old freight road that'll take us to Bitter Creek. From there, it's another day to Rock Springs." Zinnia stood near a split boulder, arms crossed lightly. "You ever been that way before?" "Once," he said. "Hauled fence wire to the railway crew, dust near swallowed us whole. But the creek runs clear and the lowlands are quiet." She nodded, then swung into the saddle behind him without needing his hand. Her grip around his waist was sure but light. They rode in silence for a long stretch, the trail narrowing between cliffs. Loose shale clattered beneath the horses' hooves, and the wind funneled through the stone in slow, hollow breaths. Somewhere above them, a hawk circled, wings slicing the sky. It wasn't until they'd reached the flats beyond the gorge that Zinnia spoke. "You said your brother died," she said quietly. "Did you stay long after?" Zeke didn't answer right away. "I buried him on the West Hill. Spent the next 2 weeks pulling up the fence posts we'd set together. Couldn't look at the place without hearing him cuss every time we hit rock." She shifted behind him, not speaking. "I sold it to a man from Fort Bridger," he continued. "He had sons, said they'd mend what we hadn't finished. I hope they did." They passed a stand of cottonwoods, the leaves just starting to yellow at the edges. Zeke slowed the horse near a stream and let it drink. "Do you miss it?" Zinnia asked. He looked toward the distant hills. "I miss the quiet between work. The kind when your body's worn and you're too tired to think crooked, but not the emptiness after he was gone." She slid down first when they stopped to rest. Her boots sank into soft earth by the water. She crouched there, rinsing her hands and face. When she stood, she didn't move away. "I've never had land of my own," she said. "But I've imagined it. Rows of currants, a patch for onions, maybe a goat if I could find one gentle enough not to knock me over." Zeke smiled faintly. "You do better than most men I've seen try." She looked at him, eyes steady. "I don't want to live behind someone else's name. If I build something, I want it to be mine." "You will," he said, "if that's what you're after." She stepped closer, resting a hand on his chest. "I want more than just a roof. I want to wake up with someone who listens when I speak. Who doesn't ask me to soften myself to fit their comfort." Zeke reached up, covering her hand with his. "Then you ought to know," he said, voice low, "that I've never heard anyone the way I hear you." Her eyes didn't drop. "I believe that." They stood there a moment longer, neither of them moving. Then she turned and began tying her bundle tighter, preparing to ride again. By nightfall, they reached a dry ridge above Bitter Creek. The stars were beginning to pale into view, and the moon carved a path across the fields below. Zeke built a fire near a ring of stones, while Zinnia laid out their bedrolls on the leeward side of a low slope. The wind had quieted, and the grass swayed in slow waves like breath. As they sat down to eat, she passed him a strip of dried venison. "I used to think I'd never trust a man again." He took it, chewing slowly. "I reckon I used to think I'd never be trusted." Her voice was calm. "You've been careful with me, not just kind, careful." Zeke met her gaze. "I know the difference." She nodded once, then set her tin plate aside. The fire cracked softly between them. She reached for his hand across the dirt. He took it. "After Rock Springs," she said, "I don't think I want to say goodbye." Zeke's voice was quiet. "Then don't." She leaned in, not uncertain now, and he met her halfway. The kiss was gentle but certain, a promise spoken without words, rooted in everything they hadn't needed to say. When they lay down that night beneath the open sky, they did so side by side, her head against his shoulder, his arm drawn around her back. No words passed between them. The stars blinked overhead, and the earth held still around them like it, too, was listening. The last stretch into Rock Springs ran flat and open, pale earth stretching wide beneath a hard blue sky. Zinnia sat easily behind Zeke, her chin near his shoulder, arms draped loose around his middle. Neither spoke. There was no hurry now, no fear snapping at their heels. Just the slow weight of the road beneath them and the quiet shape of something solid between them. When they reached the outskirts, Zeke pulled the horse to a stop near a stand of cottonwoods at the edge of the freight yard. The town lay ahead, low buildings, chimney smoke, the distant clatter of wagons hitting ruts. A group of railroad men passed with picks slung over their shoulders, and a woman carrying a sack of flour nodded as she passed. Zinnia swung down and stretched her legs, her eyes scanning the buildings ahead. The house is 3 blocks up, she said. Stone foundation, green shutters. She used to keep a bucket of lilacs by the door. Zeke dismounted and adjusted the gear. You want me to wait out here? No, she said. I want you to come with me. They walked together, the sun high and dry above them. Zinnia kept her steps even, her head held steady. She didn't glance around like someone afraid to be seen. She walked like she had every right to be there. A small woman in a calico apron opened the door before Zinnia could knock. Her face broke into a wide grin and she stepped forward, arms open. Well, I'll be Zinnia Fairland. I thought you were a ghost. Zinnia laughed once, real and warm. Not today, Alma. You still got a room. For you. Always, Alma's gaze flicked to Zeke, and this, Zinnia's hand found his. Zeke Nolan. Alma's eyes narrowed slightly, not unkindly. Well, Mr. Nolan, if you're here to stay, I hope you've got hands fit for repairs and a back strong enough to carry a water barrel. We don't keep idle men, Zeke nodded once. I'd rather work than sit, Alma smiled. Then come in, supper's in 2 hours, you can both wash up out back. Inside, the boarding house smelled of bread and stove polish. The walls were hung with stitched samplers and pale curtains that fluttered in the breeze. Zinnia's room sat at the top of the stairs, clean and spare, with a narrow bed and a window looking east. She stood in the doorway, her hand still woven with Zeke's. It's not much. It's yours, he said. That night, supper was stew and cornbread, served at a long table crowded with boarders, 2 schoolteachers, a widower who worked at the feed mill, and a girl of 12 who read aloud from a dime novel between bites. Zinnia sat beside Zeke, her back straight, her voice easy. When Alma passed with a second pot of coffee, she leaned close and whispered, You look different, like someone who stopped carrying something heavy. Zinnia only smiled. Later, after the dishes were washed and the fire in the stove banked low, Zeke stood at the back porch, looking out over the darkened yard. Zinnia came up beside him, her shawl pulled tight around her. You thinking about going? She asked. He shook his head. I'm thinking about staying. She watched his face. You don't owe me anything. I know, he said. But I want to be near you, not just for a while, for the rest of it. Zinnia's breath caught just once. I never thought I'd want to say yes to something like that. He turned toward her. What changed? I did, she said. You didn't try to fix me. You just stayed long enough for me to remember who I was. He reached for her then, and she stepped into his arms without hesitation. They stood like that for a long time beneath a sky full of stars, no words. Just the steadiness of breath, the quiet thrum of closeness earned not through promises, but through all the days they'd already walked side by side. 3 months later, they married in Alma's parlor. Zeke wore his only clean shirt, and Zinnia stitched her own dress from a bolt of cotton she'd saved in her satchel that first day. Alma stood as witness, and the school teachers made a garland from wild daisies they found near the creek. They didn't speak vows. They just looked into each other's eyes and nodded, and that was enough. Afterward, Zinnia folded her arms around Zeke's neck and whispered, I'm not afraid anymore. And he said, You never needed to be. They bought a small patch of land just outside town, a 2-room cabin with a root cellar and a narrow front porch. Zeke took work hauling timber and helped rebuild the bridge after the spring thaw. Zinnia reopened her sewing table and made dresses for ranch wives and curtains for the schoolhouse. They planted onions and sweet corn, and Zeke built a fence from split pine. There was a goat, ornery but manageable, and a hound pup that followed Zeke home one evening and never left. They didn't need much, just the long days and the soft nights and each other. And in the years that followed, when folks asked how they found one another, Zeke would just look at Zinnia and say, She was locked in a shed. I opened the door. And Zinnia would take his hand and add, And I let him stay. And that was the truth of it, not a rescue, not a miracle. Just 2 people who had the good sense to recognize something worth keeping and the grit to build a life around it.